Welcome to episode 4 for the Beyond the Blade podcast. This is a wonderful opportunity that we have today, and we're very grateful for Dr. Thomas Hitchcock for joining us on the Beyond the Blade podcast. He is the Chief Science Officer for Crown Laboratories, which are the manufacturers of SkinPen. And SkinPen is basically one of the leading microneedling devices in the industry right now, in the aesthetics industry. And as you know, my purpose of creating the Beyond the Blade podcast is to bring you information from the source, not just me giving you my thoughts or my views on a lot of these industry-leading technologies, but I want you to hear it from those that either invented it, that are leading the companies, and that can give us a much deeper dive into this information. So Dr. Hitchcock, we'd like to thank you for joining us on this Saturday morning. We want to open the floor to have you kind of explain your background and what brought you to Crown Laboratories.
Sure. So I am a formally trained geneticist. That's what my doctorate is in. I then went on to do postdoctorate work at Duke and Yale Universities in tissue engineering. And in that vein, I was also looking at a little bit of gene therapy, although not directly into humans, but for the purpose of tissue engineering. And then I went on to Weill Cornell Medical College, where I did some work in multiple myeloma, again, with potentially gene therapy and some genetics in there. I then was a very poor fellow in New York City at that time and decided that I was not interested in the tenure track professor type of career. So I decided to look into industry. One of the funny things about both the MD and PhD kind of track is that they don't really tell you the breadth of what you can actually do with those positions or with those degrees. They kind of tell you you're either going to be a physician of some sort or you're going to be a professor of some sort. But there's actually quite a bit out there. And one of the things is in the industry, there's a lot of research positions, but there's also a lot of things like medical affairs, innovations, and all these things I was not aware of, but I was recruited by a smaller company that was trying to get going. They were doing a dermal filler with particulate. It was a particulate dermal filler. I did not necessarily enjoy my time at that company, but it got me to cut my teeth in the aesthetics industry. And it actually started to pique my interest because I was coming from a relatively high science background and seeing a little bit of a softer side of science in the aesthetic industry that that gave me some ideas of how it could actually, bolster a little bit and put a little bit more science back into the industry. I went on from there. I didn't really have a lot of clout at that time. I was just starting out in the industry. I went on to follow my boss that went to another company called Ulthera, and I took a position there with her. And at that point, I started to find that there was a little bit more scientific merit in what we were doing. And we were able to sell that company to MERS and make some money. All of us there really made some money from that. And I used that money actually not to buy a bigger house or, a boat or something like that, but I actually used it to start another company of my own. So at that point, I started a company called Zuri Therapeutics. And I actually joined a former colleague of mine to co-found another company called Bellis Medical. And Bellis Medical was where the SkinPen came from. It was actually the very first, it was the second product that we were selling, where with Zuri Therapeutics, we were looking to take the skin microbiome and engineer it to be used for inflammatory skin issues. Fast forward a few years to 2018-19, we were lucky enough, well, not lucky enough, I should say, but we were fortunate enough to be the world's first FDA-cleared microneedling device. It took us a lot of work to get there, but at the same time, that caught the attention of Crown Laboratories, who had just been invested in by a family fund, Hildred Capital, and they actually were looking to get into aesthetics, and so they wanted something like the SkinPen device, and so they ended up acquiring Bellis Medical, and they asked me if I would stay on as CSO, and I told them I couldn't. I was the CEO of this other company that I was trying to get, to market, and they basically ended up agreeing to buy that company as well. And so I ended up with both the technologies and research that I've done for several years that I got to keep doing it. And that was one of the main reasons why I wanted to join Crown Laboratories as CSO, because it allowed me to take the research I had been doing and to see it through and position in the way that I thought was appropriate. And that's where I am today.
Oh, that's fantastic. What an amazing evolution that you've had, and that you're able to actually apply the science that you're passionate about in your everyday life and in helping other people, achieve their aesthetic goals. Can you tell us, let's talk to the audience about, maybe some people have never even come across SkinPen. They don't know what it is. Can you let us know what is SkinPen, maybe some of the safety profile? I know you worked a lot on getting it FDA approved, and maybe just give us some history on that device.
Sure. So when we first started selling the SkinPen brand, it was actually a white labeled brand that was basically the same thing as you would find out there with other companies. There was a few startups at the time that were trying to get traction. It was an emerging treatment in the aesthetic industry. Then what we realized quickly was that the devices that we were white labeling and selling, there's a lot of deficits in the way it was engineered. And one of the main deficits was that although the cartridge manufacturing was cheap as far as the acquisition of the cartridge to then resell to the physician to be used for the end client, it had some engineering issues, meaning the way that it works is basically the motor pushes down a plunger that pushes the needles into the skin, but then the motor then retracts, but it doesn't retract the needles. It actually just retracts the motor, and it's a spring that actually retracts the needles. And so basically what you end up having is this, not arguing, this disparation, this difference of forces. So you have the force of the spring springing back, you have the force of the motor pushing in, and the cadence ends up getting messed up because that spring, that's a cheap spring typically, doesn't have the same force as the motor. They don't tune it that finely, or at least they didn't back in the day. And so what ended up is with a lot of people, you'd see treatments where the needles actually were just kind of scratching the skin, weren't going in all the way. You really weren't getting precision treatment. So it took a lot, and that's where you still see some remnants of you need to get bloody to get a good treatment, because really that's the only way that they knew that the needles were getting down there. And so they had to really be aggressive to get any type of efficacy. So we thought about, how do we make this a better treatment? How do we make this where it's less of a guessing game and you kind of get what you think you're getting. When you dial the pen to a certain depth, you're getting to that depth and there's no questions asked. And so we actually re-engineered the device. While we were in the midst of that, the FDA actually started sending out warning letters to companies because there was no microneedling device that was cleared through the FDA. The FDA had never basically cleared it, and they said this is not a cosmetic treatment. This is a medical treatment. These are medical devices. You are actually piercing the skin. And so luckily, we were far enough along in our development that the FDA said to us that they wanted to partner with us to actually write the guidance documents for anybody who wanted to put microneedling devices through the FDA, which was a huge opportunity for us because it meant that, rather than having to go off the market and get all the work done, we could actually stay on the market while we're doing the work with the FDA. And so we went through all the clinical studies, the engineering, and it was a rough road, but by the time we got to it, we then got to be the first cleared device. And it was about, I think we got the clearance in 2018, sold pretty soon thereafter. But interestingly, the day that we closed the deal, not too many days after that, actually the second device from a German company got approved as well. And so we ended up beating them by, several months, but it was our guidance that any other devices then had to meet the requirements in order to get on the market. So that was one of the key functions that even today, only our company has microneedling devices. We actually acquired another company that used ours as a predicate. but we're the only ones that have that active retraction. All the other devices, to our knowledge, actually use this type of spring or rubber band or something, and you end up with that odd cadence that can lead to not getting the correct depth or the correct force to penetrate scar tissue, which is very important, right? When you're dealing with scar tissue, you have fibrosis, it's hard to penetrate. You need something that's actually pushing it to the right depth so you can actually break up that scar tissue. And so we found that we had an edge there. But interestingly, it wasn't until we launched another technology, which is where my Zycrope Therapeutics research came into play. We launched that in 2022. And we really saw a huge difference in the outcomes of microneedling. And I think you might have something to say about this, because one of the things that most people in the aesthetic industry tend to forget is that there's no real magic wands. You can't just do a treatment and then expect everything to go the same for everybody in every case. And part of the main consideration is, how are you caring for the skin pre and post treatment, or how are you caring for the body pre and post treatment? People's diets are going to play into the outcomes that they have. As a plastic surgeon, I'm sure you've done plenty of treatments where people do things that they shouldn't after the treatment, and they end up with adverse effects that then you have to go and correct, like fibrotic tissue and such, because they're eating too many salty foods, not drinking enough water. And so that's one of the things that we found out, and we're kind of amazed, is that while microneedling does some great stuff as far as remodeling of the skin, if the skin is in its best place prior to the treatment, you get much better results, to where we actually were shocked to see the outcomes.
Correct. The diet, the lifestyle, whether they smoke or not, all of that has a major impact on their post-surgical recovery and reducing adverse events, reducing complications. It's part of the reason why I separately created a second company that is called Hydrology Wellness here in Coral Gables, Florida, and that is dedicated predominantly to that, to optimization of the patient pre-surgery, post-surgery, with all different types of modalities for that. But yeah, that's excellent information. Can we talk about the indications for SkinPen, and what are maybe the top treatment applications that can be addressed with that device?
Sure. So, of course, because it's a FDA-cleared and regulated device, we have to speak what we call on label, meaning what has been actually studied and cleared by the FDA as an indication for the device. It doesn't mean it's the only indications it can be used for. And interestingly, the FDA just put out a guidance where it's allowing the industry to talk about off-label indications as long as it has been peer-reviewed and tested as far as the indication. And so, of course, you're required to put all the guardrails around that, as far as you have to cite your indications and the checks and balances of the study, like how robust was it, all that stuff. So the ones that have been approved or cleared through the FDA is for the fine lines and wrinkles of the neck, as well as for acne scarring. And though acne scarring was the initial indication, and then the fine lines and wrinkles of the neck was the second indication, there are subsequent indications that have been studied and published in peer-reviewed literature. And unfortunately, I can't really get into all the details of the studies on this podcast, because then you'd be required to put all the links and stuff below for me not to get in trouble. But anybody can look into the medical literature and see if there's several other indications that we've tested and seen great results.
Yeah, we very much enjoy using it in many different applications. Personally, as a plastic surgeon, I've really enjoyed using it for scar treatments as well. Afterwards, we're using it in combination with plasma or PRP, to help with that regeneration of tissue. And a lot of people, I think, need to realize that when you're talking about modifying a scar post-surgically, that you don't want to wait too long after the scar already has gone through its maturation process. So we like to jump on that pretty much within the first 2 months after surgery, to start considering any type of scar modulation, scar changing with different techniques. But definitely microneedling is one of my favorite ones. SkinPen is so easy to use, super user friendly, very simple, very straightforward. This is coming from a plastic surgeon who had at least two other microneedling devices in the past, and I've just basically gone strictly to SkinPen, and very happy with that device. And my staff also learned it very quickly, very easy to use for them. So we really enjoy using that. What are some of the post treatment? Let's say we're talking about strict indications, FDA, like an acne scar case. Can you tell us a little bit about what are some of the post procedure instructions or things to avoid after having microneedling done? What are some of the tips?
Yeah. So that interestingly, one of the things that you just mentioned about post-surgical scars, not that we can get into it too much, but there is a study by a plastic surgeon up in Pennsylvania, Dr. Brandon Clater and his colleagues, that speak to that. And so I encourage anybody that's interested, because he also had this idea years ago that why are we waiting for a year plus, to wait till a scar matures, and why don't we try to mitigate the formation of that scar kind of right after surgical procedures? And so I would encourage anybody to read that if they're interested in what you had just mentioned, what you like to use it for. As far as instructions post-procedure, there's the typical things that you would think are self-evident or obvious, but unfortunately some people just don't think about it because sometimes the procedure is such little downtime that people don't realize that they are still compromised within a 24-hour period. So we've had people that have gone out to see their kids play in a baseball game in the direct sunlight right afterwards, and things of that nature. Really, the biggest consideration, though, that I like to tell people when lecturing and such is something that is kind of controversial within aesthetics. With that being, I don't believe you should put anything on the skin post microneedling until the day after. And the rationale for this is, of course, there's a lot of companies with the popularity of the microneedling procedure that they like to put things onto the face, or like to sell to physicians things to be put on the face, and they instruct them, they say it's going to make the treatment better this, the treatment better that. The biggest thing that I would say to any physician that is doing microneedling is, well, where is the evidence that that is the case? Because you have to think about what exactly, needling itself is a very low downtime procedure anyway. So people that are telling you you're going to have less downtime, well, there's not a whole lot of downtime to begin with. So what's the purpose? Is there a benefit that outweighs the risk of putting something on directly after? Because right after microneedling, you tend to have these microchannels that are still open in the skin. Sometimes that manifests in a little bit of pinpoint bleeding, but a lot of times you will not know that they're still open. You might see redness, but you won't know that there's still these microchannels. And the idea is that these microchannels, although the skin tends to push things out, not suck things in through these channels, a lot of people are doing a couple of things. First, putting things on after, but also then microneedling stuff in during the treatment. And that can get a little bit touchy because there is documented medical literature cases where people have needled rather benign things like HA serums into the skin and had people result in facefuls of granulomas. And those, as you're well aware, do not just go away overnight. Those are things that persist and can disfigure a person for quite a while. I actually have a podcast of my own. I don't know if I'm allowed to plug it, but it's called the Skin Science Podcast. And our last one that we just posted, I believe, we talked about this viral video where this young lady said that microneedling destroyed her face, and she has these pictures of these nodules that persisted for over a year. And it's very unlikely that was acne, because a lot of like esthetician influencers were getting on saying this is why you don't microneedle over acne. But actually, in reality, you can't spread acne that way. And that's one of the things that I spent 10 years of my life studying is the species of C. acnes and how it doesn't work that way. It's not a communicable disease. And so unfortunately, there was misinformation being spread. What happened, and I actually contacted that young lady, is that they did put something on her face and they needled it in, and she ended up getting a face full of granulomas. And now I did not examine her, or nobody I know myself examined her, so I'm speculating based on the picture she provided, the timeline that she provided, and what was ultimately necessary for her to get her skin back to relatively normal. But the fact was, she's not alone, because there are documented cases of things like exosomes. And I use that as a generic term, which I hate, because not all exosomes are the same thing, but there are people that have used these exosomes and they don't really tell you what exosomes they are, but there's been necrotic tissue that's happened through that, through needling that in. There's been granulomas, HA serums, vitamin C serums, and these are all documented in the medical literature. They're not anecdotal in the sense that I just hear about them. Although in the 10 years that I've been overseeing the science and medical portion of the microneedling business that we do, pretty much all the adverse events that I ever see are because somebody needled something in. And you, with needling, never really see any adverse events other than the occasional track marks because somebody goes out in the sun and they shouldn't, so they get some swelling that occurs. So for us, for post-care, I really encourage physicians to ask, should I really be needling this in? Is it pharmaceutical injection grade substances that I'm needling in, or is it a cosmetic substance that has preservatives and carbomers, things that are not meant to be inside of living tissue that the body can then identify as a foreign body? Because you run the risk of getting these foreign body responses, which, it's funny because years ago I would lecture a lot more than I do now on microneedling, and I would have people come up and say, well, I've done it on hundreds of people, never had a problem. Well, the point is not that you've gotten away with it. The point is what happens when you have somebody that has this issue and then now you get sued, or you have to go through, watching this person struggle for a long time before they get their skin back and, hopefully it comes back to the way that they want it and not, have any additional complications. But one of the things that we would say is that pre-treatment and post-treatment for your skin as best you can is probably the best way to get the best treatments or best results. And one of the ways that we've discovered is that not just using any topical will do necessarily, because unfortunately there is what we call dysbiosis that occurs through overuse of certain substances on the skin. It's something that's more prevalent in the Western world because of the habits that we have, the over-sanitation, the overwashing, the overuse of preservative systems, both in our topical products and in our foods. And so we end up where the trillions of microbes that live in our skin that are what we call commensal or symbiotic, that actually help us to be healthy, that are necessary for healthy skin, they end up imbalanced. So too much of one, not enough of the other. It's why we see things like atopic dermatitis, rosacea, even acne is contributed to by dysbiosis. There's even evidence that things like psoriasis, which are thought to be autoimmune issues, are actually in part contributed to by dysbiosis, because we see less of key microbes like C. acnes, which used to be thought to cause acne. Actually, in every single inflammatory disease state, including acne, there's less C. acnes species in the skin. And so we've actually developed technology in a brand we call BioJuve that actually implements a protective strain of C. acnes. It's called C. acnes defendans. And it's used to basically keep the skin in symbiosis or balance. So the theory is that if the skin is in balance and the skin biome, the ecosystem of the skin is in balance, you reduce the chronic low-level inflammation that contributes to aging and inflammatory skin issues. And then therefore the body, the physiology of your body, can actually concentrate on the regeneration of the treatment that you've just done, versus fighting off this dysbiosis. And so we actually did a clinical study of over 100 individuals where we looked at this, and we saw results that were extremely, what's the word? Transformative, I guess is the best word. Where in my 10 years of doing microneedling, although I've seen some pretty good softening of scarring, like acne scarring, we saw where it looked like the person had photoshopped off that acne scar because it was just absolutely gone. And so you can actually look up if you go onto like a search engine and you look at XYCM42, that's the strain designation, you can find the clinical study where we paired the microneedling, the SkinPen, with this microbiome technology, and we compared it to skincare, bland skincare. So we used like a placebo group, and you'll see that there's very, very different responses. And so we feel strongly that pre and post care, proper pre and post care, is actually imperative to getting the results you want with microneedling or any other aesthetic treatment.
To clarify for the audience, so let's say I were to do a SkinPen treatment today, I would, in your opinion, in your group's thought, I would not put anything on my face at the same time immediately afterwards. I would wait about 24 hours, and then I would start, for example, the BioJuve treatment program, or the
correct.
It's an ointment, a serum. How does that come to BioJuve?
The living technology, the actual microbes come in a oil-based serum that you have to mix with a water spray because they're freeze-dried microbes to keep them dormant, so you can keep them at room temperature for many months. Then you mix it in your hand and then apply to your face, and that way you wake them up, and then they're living and metabolizing and such. There also is a cleanser that we recommend because, unfortunately, a lot of cleansers contain way too many surfactants and such and preservatives that will kind of, we don't realize, but when we wash soaps off of our face, there's still residue from the soap left on our face. And it basically creates an environment that is antimicrobial. So if you're going to try to put microbes on, you have to use a cleanser that actually prepares the skin to accept the microbes, not kill the microbes. And so that's really the heart of what we're recommending, is that the nighttime is a very important time. It's a third of your life, basically, where you're not out in the sun, you're sleeping. So we really recommend people use that time to what we call microbioform your face, and just don't use the retinoids, don't use anything with preservatives, just let your symbiosis, your balance come back. We do have products that we have adjunct products, things like biome-friendly moisturizer, a ferment product to seal in the zycrobes, those are the microbes that's the name we gave them. And those are mainly so that you can use whatever makeup products or whatever you want, and you're not going to just kind of cause dysbiosis during the day as much as possible. Those aren't required to be used, but we recommend them just for a holistic approach to kind of maintaining that symbiosis of the skin. And we've seen it very successful when people use the regimen, but we also see people having great results when they use just the serum at night with the cleanser, and making sure that they don't kind of disrupt it at night.
Yeah. So as a practitioner, is there a website, or is there educational content that we can access for, let's say, my colleagues that are listening, on maybe like a stepwise protocol on what's the best way to maybe start first with the face wash, then do the microneedling treatment, then do 24 hours later the BioJuve, and then how long to go? Is that accessible to us?
So you could go to the BioJuve website. They just rebranded it. It looks really great, but that's mostly marketing stuff. But you can communicate with the company and get the medical affairs team through the website, and they can give you whatever you're interested in. Additionally, you can do your own research if you go to, like I said, if you Google XYCM42, the protocol used in the clinical research, you can see the research, you can see all the indications, you can see all the inclusion-exclusion criteria. You can look at the protocol that was used and mimic that if you're interested as well. So either way, you just got to contact either directly the company or just look at the company's medical literature that's been published. and all of that.
Okay. Oh, that's excellent. Okay, let's just touch upon for a few minutes, if you can give us maybe from the scientific standpoint, like what is actually happening to the skin when you're microneedling? Like what is the transformative process there?
Yeah, and so this is something that still is, there is some research that's being done to understand completely what's happening from a physiological standpoint. But what we do know is that when you pierce the skin with a needle, and a lot of people, we talked about earlier that there are some people that feel you need to be bloody. There's that propagation, but in all of our clinical research, we never do that. We only go to slight pink because we feel strongly that the release of blood and platelets and such actually encourages a more fibrotic type of healing. So one of the things that as a plastic surgeon you probably can relate to is that why do we get scar tissue? You know, what is it that causes scar tissue? So why do plastic surgeons take such painstaking measures to match the skin back up to skin the way it was before the incision was made? Well, that's because there's mechanisms by which the skin cells actually react based on the environment they are in. And so if they're in an environment where all of a sudden their neighbor is gone because something cut it and moved it away and then moved it, and now there's a new neighbor, it's going to react because that's considered to it an injury. So it's going to react. If there's something that ablates it like a laser, so that its neighbor dies because of thermal injury, it'll react a separate way. There's another mechanism by which heat shock proteins and such are produced. Microneedling is interesting because these needles, microneedles, are so small that they can actually pierce the skin. And anybody who's ever used a insulin syringe, it's a very similar gauge needle, and you can actually inject somebody with an insulin syringe and they won't even feel it. It depends on, of course, where and your technique and such, and if the needle's sharp. But that's where that's what you're doing with microneedles. You have basically 14 or so needles that are in relatively close proximity that are stamping up and down and making these micro injuries. But they're mechanical in nature. They're not thermal in nature. They're not chemical in nature. So the injury is looked at by the body as a very interesting type of injury because you're not changing the environment. The neighbors are all still there. You've caused a physical separation, but then it's like if you take, it's not like when you put your finger in Play-Doh and you take the finger out and there's still a hole in it. It's more like putting your finger in Jell-O. The hole actually collapses back on itself. And although there's an obvious physical injury, it can be very difficult to discern where that injury occurred because the molecules of the Jell-O are separated, but they've been placed exactly back where they were before the injury. And that's what happens with microneedling, is that there's a lot of different things that the cell detects as an injury, but there's a certain capacity to where it says, I only need to go down this pathway, which is a non-fibrotic pathway, versus a fibrosis, which occurs when you have more robust injury. An example of this is that when you look at fetal tissue in the first couple of trimesters of life, you can do a mechanical injury and you won't see a scar. And what happens is when you look at a histology there, you can see that one of the things that's associated with fetal tissue when it's recovering is much less influx of immune cell presence. Because when you have a huge amount of inflammation in the skin, then it leads to fibrotic tissue. And so that's one of the things that, when you actually cause blood to come out, it actually encourages a more fibrotic, because it actually is going to call the immune system to come clear that clot. And so when you cause microinjury without bloodletting, you tend to not see as high of an influx of the immune cells that flood into that area. And so therefore you tend to see less fibrotic results. Now, practitioners can use this information because, for instance, things like laser, we know that it has a very similar set of indications, like fractional laser, not like, complete ablation, but fractional laser can actually do very similar things to microneedling. The difference is that it's an ablative procedure in those microinjuries, so you end up getting more of a fibrotic type of response, although it's very small. So therefore, you tend to not see much difference in the quality of the skin. But most people that get repeated fractional laser treatments tend to get more of that waxy look because you tend to get collection of fibrotic tissue. With microneedling, you don't have that because you don't get the fibrosis. And you're trading because with fibrosis, you get tightening. And that's where a lot of modalities actually want that. Like, when you're getting like liposuction, you get you get that plasma or you get the RF. It's for the purpose of causing fibrosis so you can tighten that skin. You don't normally get, especially in older patients, you won't get a lot of tightening unless you cause fibrosis. And so really you can use that knowledge and talk with your patient about what is your goal? Do you care about trading off a little bit of your texture for a little bit of tightening, or do you just want to completely just retexturize your skin and have it like normal, young, healthy skin, and you're okay with a little bit of sagging that you can get a facelift later? So that's really some of what's going on. And so a lot of people confuse microneedling for what we now call colloquially RF microneedling, which is kind of a misnomer because it's not, microneedling tends to put in millions of micro injuries in the face at a given sitting, where with RF microneedling, you're basically putting in the hundreds, maybe low thousands, because the goal for RF microneedling is not to get as many injuries as possible. It's to actually cause coagulation of the tissue at the point of the needle injury to cause fibrosis, to cause tightening. And so RF microneedling, basically you have a needle that goes in at the very tip. It puts out electrical impulse that actually burns the tissue to what we call coagulation, which means that all the proteins kind of lose their form and such. And you're basically subablation, which is causing a little necrotic tissue that is going to cause a fibrosis, a small little teeny fibrosis. And so, as a plastic surgeon, you probably are concerned if somebody gets too many of those treatments somewhere you want to eventually do a facelift, because then you have to dissect around this fibrosis. Where microneedling, you wouldn't see that fibrotic type of response. So they're very different things. So they're used for different reasons, and based on the patient's requirements or desires, you would choose one or the other.
Now, let's say we had a clinical scenario where we had a woman that had just, some fine lines and wrinkles in her neck, and she's going to ask, Dr. Z, how many of these microneedling sessions am I going to have to do here to kind of see a result? Number one, and number two, are these painful? Or is it going to hurt me?
Well, the answer is it doesn't tickle. They do require topical numbing. And the good news is because, now if you were to do an RF treatment, they tend to be a little more uncomfortable simply because you're causing that injury underneath of where topicals can typically get to. So unless you're doing like a nerve block or something, it can be a little spicy, similar to something like Ulthera would have been, because you're causing coagulation under the tissue that can be numbed topically. Some people do nerve blocks and such for that purpose. For microneedling, you don't need a nerve block. You just need a topical anesthetic. It usually does take around 20 to 25 minutes, maybe 30, to get numb enough to where it's going to be pleasant for the individual. Then you just feel vibration mainly at that point. You don't really feel anything at that. Some people that do relatively superficial treatments just for people that have overall healthy skin, that just want to kind of get some retexturing or cell turnover at like a 1/4 millimeter or maybe up to a half. They don't necessarily need to numb if they have a relatively good tolerance. So I myself have done or had it done to me at 1/2 millimeter, and I didn't use any numbing and I was okay. Again, it doesn't tickle. It doesn't necessarily feel good, but it's one of those things where if you use topical lidocaine, you don't feel it at all, really. You just feel a little bit of vibration. As far as how many you need to do, say, on the neck for fine lines and wrinkles, it really comes down to how severe the wrinkles are and what other modalities are you using in conjunction. If you're doing monotherapy, we tend to say you should stick to doing 6 to 8 treatments and let it go at that. And then wait for a few months and then reassess whether you should do another round. Because the problem is that just like most things in medicine, drugs included, your body will acclimate to injury and you'll start to lose the benefit of the treatment over time. At least you'll lose getting as robust a response. So you need to let the body, it takes about 6 months before the body's completely remodeled after injuries. And so you need to let the body kind of do its thing, get to where it is, and then you can kind of assess whether you need an additional round of treatments. Again, I go back to really, it also comes down to if the person is willing to invest in proper post and pre-care, because if they are, then you can reduce the number of treatments significantly to get the results. So that's what I would say. I would say if you're willing to invest in the proper post care, you can probably get away with maybe 4, where normally you would take maybe 8.
And how frequently are you doing these sessions?
So we typically tell people a month apart, but frankly, we have started to in our own clinics. We have a pilot clinic in Dallas where we do a lot of our pilot clinical studies. We've actually reduced it to 3 weeks and seen just as good responses. And that, again, I think comes down to, the flexibility that I think clinicians like is not having to have a strict schedule as far as when they come in. Dr. Des Fernandez, who's kind of the father of microneedling, and back in the day, he used the manual stamps and stuff. He actually was at one point recommending 2 weeks between treatments. However, it really comes down, and I don't know if there's any necessarily evidence that you shouldn't do it that close together, but you do need to allow the body to at least heal from the first before you start doing the second one.
Yeah, no, that makes total sense. Yeah, we've been doing about a 30-day interval between each. So.
Mm-hmm.
All right. I mean, I think we've really given a very comprehensive introduction to SkinPen and everything that it entails. Can you let everybody know how to access more information, maybe from you? I know you had mentioned earlier your podcast, but maybe mention that again. Any other websites? I know you had mentioned BioJuve, and see so that we can get that word out there.
Yeah, so if you're a physician or clinician and you want more information, you can always email medinfo@crownaesthetics.com. That's MEDINFO, one word, at crownaesthetics.com. And we have a team of scientists and physicians that actually will read those requests as far, and, it ranges from anything like, how do I do this indication with this device? We have several things that we sell and manufacture in our facility. And it can be anything up to, I've had an adverse event. Can you help me to kind of think through this? And so we do have people that can help you with that as well. If you're a consumer or a patient, unfortunately, we can't do that same level of service because there are regulations about what we can and can't say to consumers versus physicians. But we very much recommend that you go to the websites for skinpen.com or biojuve.com or progen.com, anything that you're interested in, and then go to your physician. Your physician can always relay the question for you if it's a tough question. But most of that stuff you can find cursory on the website. And then if you want to dig a little deeper and you're a Sherlock Holmes as a consumer or as a patient, you can always look in like PubMed.gov, which has the clinical research, and you can Google the terms either SkinPen or microneedling or BioJuve or microbiome, and you can find information there. However, to all people who are not physicians or scientists that are listening to this, I would highly recommend that you don't become Dr. Google, that even if you do research on your own, bring that research to your physician or your clinician and ask them to go over it with you, because there are nuances in all this stuff that are very important. And most of the people that are good clinicians will actually take the time to answer those types of questions. And they've been around the block enough to know what's what when it comes to reality. Because keep in mind, clinical studies are very controlled environments and patients and such. they don't always translate to your particular situation, the medicines you take, the diet you have, the lifestyle that you lead. So you need to make sure you speak with your physicians first.
And your podcast?
My podcast is the Skin Science Podcast with Dr. Thomas Hitchcock. We're on hiatus right now, but we have a couple more episodes coming out, and then we'll have a month off and start again in January.
Awesome. All right. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Hitchcock, for joining us this morning on our Beyond the Blade podcast. It was an absolute pleasure. You're excellent at explaining all of these devices and modalities and treatments. We hope to have you on in the future. I know you have other devices that we can talk about as well. And,
sure.
And we look forward to incorporating all of that into our practice. So thank you so much and have a wonderful day.
You too. Pleasure.